Our last speaker today is one whose work in Canadian art history is known to many of you, I'm sure. Lora Senechal Carney has written about the relations of modern Canadian art to its social and political context in her chapter in The Visual Arts in Canada, the 20th Century, in various articles, and in a forthcoming book. Recently, she contributed an essay to the catalogue for Kim Ondaatje's retrospective, which was a very popular show at the Agnes last fall. She is an editor of RACAR and a professor emerita at the University of Toronto. Today, Lora will talk on Pegi Nicol MacLeod. Please welcome Lora Senechal Carney.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. You added to what I said. That was very kind. Can you hear me well? Is the volume good? Okay, thank you. When one reads through what has been written and said about Pegi Nicol MacLeod, it becomes very clear that she was a person you could not fail to notice. She made an extremely powerful personal impression, as is shown by these bits mostly from interviews that were done by Joan Murray and Laura Brandon. Her painting was often subsumed into that impression. To the critic Graham McInnes, quote, Pegi Nicol's personality was like her painting, ebullient, elfin, and wayward, with a curiously fey quality that was unmistakable. Her friend Nora McCullough said that her paintings, like her, just poured out. And since Nicol died when she was only 45, she was never really seen as having lost that incredible spontaneity and vitality and joie de vivre and her gamin quality. And a quick glance at a few photos will help to explain that impression as well. 1933, with her dear friend Marion Scott seated there beside her at a party given for the two of them by Toronto artists. That same year, at a sketching picnic with the artist Will Ogilvie and the family of Charles Comfort. These photos are witness to the close friendships that Pegi had in Toronto's progressive art circles, professional and personal relationships. Circles that included writers and critics as well, and she actually became central to those circles during her 3 years there, the years that I'm most interested in for the sake of this paper. Nicol, in 1934, working on the set she designed for a production of The Pied Piper at Harthouse, University of Toronto, and 1934, again, reading her poetry to Will Ogilvie and the poet Leo Kennedy, important Montreal poet of those years. 34 again with Ogilvie and the Comfort family in a roadside picnic. Same year with Charles Comfort. Same year in a haymow near Toronto with her artist friends. There's Bob's Hayworth in the foreground. And December 1936 at her wedding to Norman MacLeod, and a year and a half later with Louise Comfort holding her beloved daughter Jane. And finally, 1945, Fredericton, New Brunswick, at the Observatory Art Center, of which she was the co-founder and where she taught from 1941 until her last summer. And finally, then 2 photos from 1948 at the Art Center with her friend Madge Smith, who became more or less a dealer to her, and with Jane. But the main point of all that is that it absolutely doesn't and must not define her work, as it often has done. The modern woman and the modern artist must be seen separately. Nowhere is this clearer than in the self-portraits, which, especially from mid-career on, have so little to do with how you just saw her being seen. Some of these self-portraits that I'm going to run through very quickly, you will have seen if you heard Devin Smithers talk yesterday. David, Devin, are you here? Is Devin here? Devin's here. And Laura Brandon, who's also here, has established that Pegi Nicol painted some 24 self-portraits and closely related figure studies during her career of just over 2 decades. So then some of the major ones, one of the 2 versions of the Slough from 1928, around 1930, A Costume for a Cold Studio, 1935, A Descent of Lilies, possibly 1935, Torso and Plants, about 1935 again, a self-portrait with Begonia. On the cover, as you see, of the memorial exhibition that the National Gallery put on the year of her death. And it was also in the 1936 show of the Canadian Group of Painters. Peggy with Cyclamens, a large watercolor that was not shown during her lifetime. And then finally, the self-portrait with Jane, the fascinating self-portrait with Jane from about 1939, the last of her self-portraits as far as we know. Laura Brandon cataloged more than 500 works in the course of doing her research on Pegi Nicol MacLeod, but there may be more out there. We all know now of Laura Brandon's particular interest in the self-portraits, and in fact she had done her 1992 master's thesis here at Queen's on the self-portraits even before publishing the biography. To Brandon, the self-portraits have certain discrete symbols that document events and periods in Nicol's emotional life. And of course, to do Brandon justice, you have to read her in full. We're scholars here. But my interest, rather this time, is in stepping back and making a few big picture observations about these works as particular addresses of the modern. First, one very broad point. In all 4 of the Toronto self-portraits, there were flowers or plants, or plants. And Shearer West, in her book Portraiture, pointed out that beginning in the 16th century, sitters were placed often in detailed settings. For self-portraits, those settings were, of course, often studio settings, as in the Emily Carr painting in the exhibition, the Bobs Hayworth, the very fine Bobs Hayworth in the exhibition, and you just saw a splendid Alma Duncan. But it is also easy to think of artists who painted self-portraits with flowers and plants. Anthony Van Dyck, after 1633. Mario Nuzzi, self-portrait with flowers, but then he was a flower painter, so we could call those studio props. Gauguin, self-portrait with Japanese print and flowers, 1889. Motorzone Becker, self-portrait, 1906. Derain, André Derain, self-portrait with flowers, 1907. Natalia Goncharova, self-portrait with yellow lilies, 1907. Otto Dix, self-portrait with carnation, 1912. Egon Schiele, self-portrait with Chinese lantern plant, 1912. Parskiva Clark, self-portrait, 1937. Frida Kahlo, portrait of the artist with monkeys, 1943. Of course, Frida Kahlo, many times. And Marc Chagall, self-portrait with flowers, 1957. And didn't we also just see Anne Alma Duncan? These last examples are all by modern artists, and it's evidently in the modern period that this becomes a commonplace. There isn't time here to explore it, but I will suggest that Pegi Nicol's joined those of the women, Motorzone Becker, Goncharova, Kahlo, Clark, in refusing or at least complicating the very long association of a woman with nature and the primitive. So I'm referring again to the 2 large oils from the Toronto years, Descent of Lilies and Torso and Plants. I wanted to look at the Toronto years particularly because Nicol became very deeply involved with the most progressive art and intellectual circles in Toronto, and it was a most interesting context for an ambitious modern artist, and she really was that. She had moved to Toronto from Ottawa, her original home, in 1934 because she got some work with René Serrault, a French artist in charge of architectural design for Eaton's department stores. And just a couple of biographical details by way of showing that by the time she got to Toronto, she was a painter with an established practice. She had studied, for one thing, at the École des Beaux-Arts in Montreal, first year of his classes there actually, where she shared a first prize in artistic drawing with Marion Scott and where she won 5 medals altogether. Brandon reports that she might have gotten her interest in the figure there, and that she told Donald Buchanan that she had learned there that a line put down on paper and canvas took on an expressive reality in itself and should never be changed. Not that she didn't sometimes rework stuff, but that was a principle anyway. So a painter with an established practice, and she would pursue that practice constantly and consistently, no matter the circumstances. And since those Toronto years were in the depths of the Depression, those circumstances were very challenging. Kirk Neergarth, in his thoughtful review of Brandon's biography, noted another thing that needs to be understood about Pegi Nicol that's highly relevant here, that the Depression radicalized her, quote, politics and her art, and that she read Marx in the 20s and reread them in the 30s. I think it's very important to recognize her capacity to know the world in ways other than through the senses, to respect her quick intelligence as well as her professionalism as a painter. She entered a room like a self-portrait and her language cut quickly. That comes from one of the best known poets of the time, Frank Scott, who knew her very, very well. And a couple of quotes. Can you read them? Can you see them? From the artist Charles Goldhammer, another friend, and Louise Parkin. To accept that side of Pegi Nicol is to accept that the self-portraits go far beyond physicality and the sensual and the emotional. In Toronto, Nicol was respected as both an artist and a contributor to the larger modern project. One of Charles and Louise Comfort's daughters, Ruth Comfort Jackson, summed it up later. For 3 brief years, she'd been swept into the heart of the Toronto art community. She had designed a set for Hart House, created windows for Eaton's College Street, painted a mural in a downtown restaurant, become an art editor of the Canadian Forum, and her work was seen at the Toronto Art Gallery. And at this time, she was elected to the Canadian Society of Painters in Watercolor and the Canadian Group of Painters. And I can add that she was chosen as one of 2 judges for the 1936 exhibition of the Maritime Art Association, and she was one of only 15 artists in Walter Abel's article, Some Canadian Moderns, published in 1937 in London, England. She had also won a national prize in 1931, the Wellington Prize, beating out some of those Toronto friends. With regard to Nicol's thoughts and ideas in this period, Walter Abel should in fact be mentioned in particular. His book, Representation and Form, a Theoretical Study, came out in the middle of Nicol's time in Toronto and was very much discussed within those circles. It was essentially an argument against, and he makes this very clear in the introduction, an argument against Clyde Bell and Bell's contention that representation had nothing to do with aesthetics. To Abel, representation has everything to do with it when it enriches form. And all great art fuses subject matter and form into what he called representational form. Without representation, art is not worthwhile. Pegi Nicol reviewed Abel's book for Canadian Forum magazine and commented that the book made her feel happier to enjoy the old masters without doing so surreptitiously, and that it relieved the mind so that we, quote, may enjoy the present movements in art springing up around the world, even the propaganda painting in the countries where artists are part of the life. The critic Graham McInnes, part of those same circles, wrote a review of the book as well and said that he'd gotten the basis for a somewhat more elastic critical approach. In other words, something beyond Roger Fry and Clive Bell. And McInnes believed the best modern art, which was always representational, represented sensitivity to one's environment while obeying formal demands. This was a position that allowed for the social in art, a position in fact taken by the majority of North American artists in that period, as Esther Trepanier has pointed out. So the city scenes Nicol painted in Ottawa and Toronto, and then later, especially in New York, were both modern and social in just that sense. That begins to give a picture, I think, of the particular take on the modern that Nicol had in the Toronto years. And I turn then to the Toronto self-portraits, where the business of reflecting one's modernity through this balancing of the formal and the representational is a major issue, even though the subject matter isn't modern urban life, but in fact a kind of inverse to that, a looking in instead of out. A Descent of Lilies is both the largest and the best known of the Toronto self-portraits, and actually perhaps the best known of Nicol's career altogether. Its quality as a self-portrait is leavened perhaps by all these strange elements and their combinations, and then their connections to the recognizable ones, to a lot of suggestive but not quite definable forms. As a self-portrait, it's unique as well. A long line sweeps from the lower left up the leg and centralizes the partly draped body. And the torso is very subtly connected in color and form to the horses behind it and the lilies around it. It's carefully composed, in other words. I would suggest not the spontaneous kind of thing that Nicol's painting was usually described as. It is one of the most enigmatic paintings of Canadian art of the 30s, and most unusual for her in its lack of groundedness. To me, it's vaguely mythological, like paintings from India of the descent of the goddess Ganga to earth. But of course, it's not unusual for a modern artist to mythologize in a self-portrait. You have only to think of Frida Kahlo and of Picasso and his satyrs and minotaurs. About the only actual clue I've seen to the content is something Marion Scott said much later. I remember going to stay with her one time when she had painted that figure of herself with the lilies. Somebody had given her lilies and horses, and we were both fascinated by it. In other words, maybe it's a fantasy using elements within reach. The torso in plants is almost as large as the Descent of Lilies. It's almost a meter high. You'll have seen it now in the exhibition. It's perhaps the most startling of Nicol's paintings, but it was included by Bertram Brooker in the 1936 Yearbook of the Arts in Canada. There's much to be said about this work, but I will simply draw attention to the bold, bold painting and the Cézanne-esque modeling. Devin pointed out that Nicol, in fact, like a great many of the post-Group of Seven moderns in Canadian art, Francophone and Anglophone, were great admirers of Cézanne. And I would mention the way of building up the form with color in the figure, and also the unfinished, as Devin put it, à la Cézanne. But the thing about it that strikes me the most is something that James Hall talked about in the Self-Portrait of Cultural History, in that in his final chapter, Beyond the Face, Modern and Contemporary Self-Portraits, he says, self-portraiture in the 20th century has been many things, but its most distinctive quality is its tendency to conceal or suppress the face and head. By the same token, there has also been a shift away from the face to the body, which is harder to individualize and memorize. Full-length self-portraits, often naked, and self-portraits featuring fragments of the artist's body have proliferated. From that perspective, Nicol's work would have been more radical than anything done in Toronto, and I think in Canada for that matter. I would also relate the Toronto self-portraits with their shallow spaces that, as Devin said, can't be entered, to the still life paintings Nicol was doing at that time, in particular Plant with Mirror. The window is there as it is in two of the other Toronto self-portraits, and again the flowers in the lushly painted plants. And it's as if Nicol puts herself into the painting via the mirror, which might very well be the one she used for making her self-portraits. In the larger sense, the still lifes, like the portraits, represent times of not looking out at modern urban life, but of interiority, of contemplating the act of painting. Pascal Bonafou, a French art historian, observed in his book on 20th century self-portraiture that when artists paint self-portraits, they are making an intervention into portraiture itself that interrogates painting, the whole act of painting, its mystery and its reason for being. I can imagine Pegi Nicol doing that consciously. She was a modern artist at the height of her powers. She had both confidence and humility in front of the act of painting, and she cared about social and political issues and wanted to be modern at the same time. Her extraordinary personality and her lively intellect made her an attraction in those Toronto circles, but she was, first of all, a painter and a totally committed one. Thank you.